Title: Shadows of War, a World War II epic. Prologue: The storm approaches, 1939, Poland. The sky was overcast, a fitting omen for what was to come. Jan Kowalski, a young Polish resistance fighter, clutched his rifle as German tanks rolled into Warsaw. Across the continent, soldiers, spies, and civilians alike were being pulled into the most devastating conflict the world had ever known. Chapter 1. The invasion begins. 1939 to 1940, Poland, France, and Britain. The Nazi Blitzkrieg strategy overwhelmed Poland in weeks. Jan barely escaped, joining the Polish underground. Meanwhile, in France, Captain James Callaghan of the British Army prepared for an inevitable German assault. As the Battle of France began, the world watched in horror. Chapter 2. The Fall of France and the Miracle of Dunkirk. 1940, France, Britain. German forces advanced rapidly, trapping Allied troops at Dunkirk. Callaghan and his men held the line as the British evacuation commenced. Thousands of small boats, manned by civilians, crossed the English Channel to rescue stranded soldiers. Callaghan barely escaped, but the fight was far from over. Chapter 3. The Battle of Britain, 1940, Britain. As German bombers darkened the skies over London, RAF pilot Sarah Montgomery took to the air in her Spitfire. The Luftwaffe seemed unstoppable, but Britain's resolve held firm. The Blitz raged on, leaving the city in ruins, but Sarah and her squadron never wavered. Chapter 4. The Eastern Front ignites. 1941, Soviet Union. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a brutal invasion of the Soviet Union. Sergei Ivanov, a Soviet conscript, fought desperately to defend Moscow. The Red Army suffered immense losses, but winter turned the tide. Sergei's loyalty was tested as Stalin's purges loomed over the soldiers. Chapter 5. Pearl Harbor and the Pacific War begins. December 7, 1941, Hawaii. Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor shattered the illusion of American neutrality. Lieutenant Jack Reynolds, stationed at Pearl, barely survived the bombing. As the U.S. declared war, Jack was deployed to the Pacific, where he would face the horrors of Guadalcanal and Midway. Chapter 6. The Resistance Fights Back. 1942, France, Poland, and Norway. Jan Kowalski's underground network sabotaged Nazi supply lines, while the French resistance, led by Elise Moreau, carried out daring missions against the Gestapo. Meanwhile, in Norway, commandos launched a raid on the heavy water plant, crippling Germany's nuclear ambitions. Chapter 7. The Turning Point. Stalingrad and Midway, 1942 to 1943. Russia and the Pacific. The Battle of Stalingrad raged on, with Sergei and his comrades enduring unimaginable hardship. After months of fighting, the Soviets encircled and defeated the Sixth Army, marking a turning point in the war. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway saw Jack's aircraft carriers sink Japanese ships, shifting the momentum in favor of the Allies. Chapter 8. D-Day, the Invasion of Normandy, June 6, 1944, France. Callaghan, now a major, led his men onto Omaha Beach. Machine gun fire ripped through the landing craft, but the soldiers pressed forward. Elise Moreau's resistance network fed intelligence to the Allies, ensuring the success of Operation Overlord. The liberation of France had begun. Chapter 9. The Fall of Berlin, 1945, Germany. As Soviet troops stormed Berlin, Sergei found himself face to face with the brutal aftermath of the war. Hitler was dead, the Reich was crumbling, and the war in Europe was finally ending. But in the Pacific, the battle was not yet over. Chapter 10. The Atomic Age begins. August 1945, Japan. Jack Reynolds, now a seasoned pilot, witnessed the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended in fire, but at a terrible cost. Across the world, soldiers and civilians alike struggled to rebuild their shattered lives. Epilogue. A world forever changed. 1946, global. Jan returned to a Poland now under Soviet control, wondering if his fight had been in vain. Sarah, haunted by the war, watched as the world divided into East and West. Callaghan helped rebuild Europe, while Sergei faced an uncertain future in Stalin's Soviet Union. Jack returned home, But the memories of war would never fade.